Welcome, everyone. My name is Carsten Petersen. I am from the Transnational Institute based in the Netherlands. We are going to have an interview with Thomas Mnguni from groundWork in South Africa. This is part of a series of interviews with social movement leaders and political activists from around the world, where we discuss the threats and problems that communities are confronted with. We discuss the multiple crises, the economic crisis, environmental and climate crisis, and the social crisis. And we look at the solutions that springs up from the ground, the experiences from around the world where movements themselves are developing, advancing solutions to address these multiple crises. So also, Thomas, it's really great that you can join us for this interview. Thomas, tell us a little bit about yourself and then just a few words about groundWork as well.
Thanks, Carsten. As you've already introduced me, my name is Thomas Mnguni. I'm based in South Africa, specifically in Middleburg. And the place is currently known as Mpumalanga Province. And the place is a host to multiple Eskom coal-fired power stations, about 12 of them. And we also host Sasol petrochemical plants, which is based in Secunda. Personally, I think I started as a social activist, and most of our focus was around issues of service delivery, access to water, access to electricity, and access to social development. And I think from 2008, I was introduced through groundWork to the environmental justice concept. And I think solely because it speaks to the day-to-day activities of ordinary people. So since 2015, I've been working as a community campaigner with groundWork. Now, what is interesting is that groundWork is an environmental justice movement, and in our daily struggles, whether it's an issue around water, whether it's an issue around electricity, that speaks to what we define as environmental justice. It speaks to access to basic services. It speaks to basic human rights and whether or not people's rights are being violated. But it also speaks about where exactly does democracy lie? Does it lie with the people, or does democracy lie with the corporates? How much influence do we have in our governance system? And what do we do when there is failure of governance? So I think with my work within groundWork, I've learned that we cannot separate environmental justice to the day-to-day living of ordinary people.
Thanks, Thomas. I think you already touched on quite a few of the issues we're going to speak about here over the next 25 minutes or so. groundWork is also part of Friends of the Earth International, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And I think we also work with Healthcare Without Harm at an international level.
Excellent, Thomas. Now, in your words, what do you see as the main threats, the main problems that communities are confronted with? You already spoke about...
I think what is critical is for us to understand how our economy has been built. And that, I would say, slightly dates back to the Industrial Revolution. And in the South African context, I think when they discovered gold and they discovered diamonds, that also dictated that the country needed to have a reliable supply of electricity. And at that time, what was decided was we will extract more minerals to generate cheap electricity, which would feed most of the mines and the industries that came out of that process. And we commonly refer to the process as the mineral energy complex because of its strong reliance on mineral extraction to produce energy, and therefore assume that when we supply that energy to industries, it will create jobs, but it will also take care of the welfare of the society as a whole. So in that process, what we didn't filter was how the extractive industry destroys the environment, how the extractive industry displaces people from the land where they could earn their own livelihood, but also how the land which was used for agriculture to provide people with food is now being taken away by mining, and therefore in the process creating the problem which still persists of food insecurity. But also the energy that was generated in this process, that energy was not meant for ordinary people like me and you. That energy was meant for baseload, and baseload basically refers to industries and mines. So as much as we have this abundance of coal to produce electricity, our people are still experiencing energy poverty and energy scarcity because most of the people are still not yet connected to the grid. And the few who are still connected to the grid, we find that there are people who cannot afford electricity, therefore they are connected to the grid, but they can't use electricity. But we also saw a process where our limited water resources have been destroyed, except for the land, but through coal combustion, we saw the level of toxic emissions rising, and that created a health crisis on its own. So now we are seated with a problem where people do not have access to water, and those who have access to water cannot drink contaminated water. Therefore, they resort to buying water and drinking the contaminated water that has been provided by mostly municipal services. But we also see a high number of people with respiratory diseases, and they have to pay for their own medication because those costs are not factored in the process.
Thanks, Thomas. I think you made it very clear that what we are talking about here is some deep social problems arising from the mining and energy complex over the years in South Africa. I mean, you trace this back a little bit in time as well, and so it's not a new phenomenon, obviously. But you also started off by speaking about job creation in terms of jobs. I mean, does these industries provide a huge number of jobs, and how significant is that in the communities where you work?
So in terms of jobs, I think we need to be realistic, because sometimes to get a clearer picture as to whether mines create jobs or not, I normally prefer to compare that with the jobs within the agricultural sector, which are, I would say, more sustainable rather than the short-term or limited time-frame jobs that have been created by mines. Share the latest report, which was done by the Center for Scientific Independent Research, or the CSIR, and that research was commissioned by the Nkangala District Municipality, which is also based in Mpumalanga. Now, what they discovered in that research was that as much as Nkangala as a region has more coal-fired power plants and more mines than most of the parts of the country, the national unemployment average is higher than that of South Africa as a whole. So the current South African average is standing at 29% in terms of unemployment, but within Nkangala, the average is standing at 32 to 33% in terms of unemployment. And this basically tells us that the old apartheid system, or the old colonial system of promoting labor migration, it's still happening. As much as I would say our government is in denial about that, we still have centers which are considered labor reserves, like the former homelands or the former Bantustans. And our education level is, I would say, again, it's higher than the national average because of the migration of people. So if you go to Gauteng, you still get the same number of people who are moving from the homelands to be based in Gauteng with the hope that they will be getting jobs in that. And when they are not getting jobs, normally you would see a spike in crime, but also, I mean, there are all sorts of social abnormalities that happen in those areas. So in reality, what we've seen recently, instead of mines creating jobs, we've seen mines recycling people. So the same people who have elements, they will move from one mine to another rather than creating new jobs per se.
Thanks, Thomas. I think that's very interesting also to factor in a conversation like this, because, as you mentioned, health hazards it's a serious problem for in the entire mining sector. And I read in one of your reports that many of the workers, many of the miners are consciously aware of the threats, and they're consciously aware of the negative climate change impact of coal mining in particular. What kind of solutions that you advance in your work?
Yeah, I think it's a huge challenge, and the reality of the situation is that as time goes on, people are more concerned about bread and butter issues. People are more concerned about their livelihood, and I think through the mineral energy complex, people have been made to be more reliant and dependent on huge industries, huge sectors. But we also have to pick up that this is the intention. People are only involved in the different economies more as consumers rather than as decision makers. So we do not have a say as to how we produce things we want to consume. We do not decide how much of that do we want to consume. So this whole economic linear system, it's I would say it's a simple system wherein a few people will be involved in the decision-making process. They decide what needs to be consumed and how that should be consumed. And we only come in as consumers or as labor providers in that system. But in order for us to change this, I mean, it requires, I would say, one, for the people to acknowledge the problem in the system. If mining has a negative impact on my health, are there other alternative sectors where I can get a job so that I could be in a position to pay for my children's school fees, put food on the table? And the truth of the matter is, yes, there are alternatives, but there's a huge challenge. If we want these alternatives to work, we cannot allow a situation wherein everything becomes business as usual. So we need to begin a process wherein people are involved in decision-making processes. People plan and direct their own future and their own development. They need to define their own development. And in the current context, I think the most basic term, as much as sometimes it's confusing, but the most basic concept is the just transition. And in this regard, for me, the just transition basically speaks about how do we change the system such that it addresses people's needs, and it is being led by both ordinary people and the workers. And I'm saying it must be led by communities and workers because all the time our economic system has been led by governments and the private sector or multinational corporations. And we have seen that that system does not work to address the needs of ordinary people, but it addresses the capital needs, the needs of accumulation. So only a few people will keep accumulating the wealth. The rest of the people are getting poorer as time goes on. So this is where we need to start to say, what role do ordinary workers and people play in detecting the change in the system, such that whatever it is that we produce should speak to the people's needs rather than the needs of the market?
Thanks, Thomas. I read your report, The Destruction of the High Veld, and I recommend everyone who listening to this interview to go to groundwork.org.za and read up on this report. And in this report, you also address the issue of just transition and promotes that as a solution. But you also mentioned that one of the challenges with the just transition is that all these people who already depend on the work in the mines, for example, they're reluctant to accept the principles of just transition because, as you also mentioned, it's about their bread and butter. So what do you do in groundwork to address one of these big challenges with the just transition concept?
Thanks, Carsten. I would say it's pretty challenging, but first we need to acknowledge that a transition is happening. The problem with the transition that's not happening is that it's not just. We are seeing casualties in the process. So, for instance, we've seen a couple of mines closing around the area, and with that we've seen a huge change in social dynamics in some of the areas. For instance, with the closure of Optimum Mine, people in Henrina couldn't get water because the water treatment plant was being operated by Optimum Mine. But we also saw people in Bullenswalk, which is a mining village, losing their property, losing their livelihood because now they have to stay at home without employment. So that transition is already happening, but it has negative repercussions. Now, as groundwork, we strongly believe, and this is a process we're working on, to say, we know we don't have solutions per se, but what is important in the process is for communities and workers to be involved in a dialogue. They need to come up with a plan. They need to shape the discussion around the just transition. So we have had several meetings with community people. One, which is most important to say, what is their understanding of a just transition? Is there a need of a transition? And also try and encourage a dialogue between community people and labor unions and workers, so that at some point in time we should be in a position to have a consensus to say, in order for us to move away from coal, the following needs to happen, so that that should speak to how we rehabilitate land, how we ensure that people have access to energy, how we deal with issues around food sovereignty, how we deal with access to water, and also how we deal with climate change impacts. We need to look into human settlements. Is our human settlements resilient to climate change impacts? So those discussions should be community-centered. So I think the last discussion we held was in July, and we had both community people and labor unions in that session, and we had I would say, a very fruitful discussion. And we will be holding another discussion on the 30th of August. And this time is being organized by Labour, not even groundWork. And that discussion will be held in Hendrina, because we've already seen how the closure of mines have affected the social dynamics in the town of Hendrina. And we've been calling on our government to work with community people to begin a clear process of engagement around what is needed in terms of a just transition. What is the role of government at all levels? So we've got 3 different levels of government: national, provincial, and local. What does each sphere of government has to do in order to facilitate and assist in terms of fast-tracking the process around the just transition? And we've also been trying to bring in different community partners. Not just this is not just a groundwork issue, but we've also been trying to work with different NGOs, so that at the end of the day, whatever is going to happen should be led by community people and should be a process that is owned by the community people. So we are trying to support the process as much as we can, and also trying to develop links between the different stakeholders that are needed in the process.
Thomas, as far as I understand, just transition is it's relatively new in South Africa, but it's not new other places in the world. If I'm not mistaken, then it originated from work of labor movements in the US, and I also know that that Friends of the Earth in other parts of the world have kind of adapted the concept of just transition as a solution. Can you just speak maybe a little bit more about just transition in a South African context? Is this something that has been taken on board by the South African labor unions and by some of the other allies that you work with in South Africa? And is this something that the government is also paying attention to and to some extent endorsing?
So it's quite interesting, because we all use the same concept, which is just transition, but it might mean something different depending on where one comes from. So, for instance, Anglo-American, which we all know that they are heavily invested in coal, speaks about just transition, and in their context, it's about clean coal technology, and to them that's a transition. And if you speak to labor around issues of a just transition, their focus is mainly around job preservation, rather than how we can move away from coal, how we take issues of food, water, transport into the picture. So labor has been very resistant, to be honest, because to them, transitioning away from coal means loss of jobs, and that's one thing we don't want to see happening. We also don't want to see people losing their jobs. But what is interesting is that they don't think about how the continuous combustion of coal or the continuous operation of coal plants and mines impacts on people's health or limited water resources. So I think it's only recently where I would say some of the unions are beginning to get a slight grasp of how broad just transition is, and how it is important for everyone not to limit a just transition to a just energy transition, because I think labor limits it to a just energy transition. But I think what is common, and this is what, even if it's about just energy transition, it shouldn't be about privatization of the energy sector in the South African context. Given, I think, our parastatal financial troubles, which is Eskom, we all fear that government wants to privatize Eskom because of the financial burden they have, and they want to ease that, and they want to use the concept of a just transition to justify the whole process around privatization. So I think as a start, when we think about labor, what is common is that we all are promoting a socially owned energy system, and I think to use that as common ground and say we can use this as a building block, for me, that will be something positive out of the process. But I think in terms of how we look into just transition, it's not only focused on energy. We look into the broader picture from energy, food sovereignty, the transport system in South Africa, how we could rehabilitate the abandoned or derelict mines in South Africa and use that land for other alternatives, how we disposed of our waste, and how we could begin to move away from commercial farming and focus on subsistence farming, especially to provide organic food to locals. So there are a whole lot of issues we need to bring on board when we look into a just transition. Our education system is also key to say, how do we re-educate our society such that they realize the dangers of coal and the importance of moving away from carbon-intensive industries.
I think it's really interesting how you bridge just transition with food sovereignty in your work in groundworks. I have not come across that other places where I've read about just transition, or at least not the reference to food sovereignty, which is, I mean, also a concept that millions of peasants are advancing globally. La Via Campesina, for example, as you know them from South Africa, obviously. But it's like many groups that work with just transition and many other groups and movements that work with food sovereignty. But I hear that you're kind of bridging the two. Can you maybe, in the last couple of minutes that we have for this interview, just add a few more words about that and why that is important as part of this transitions toward what?
So I think, like you earlier mentioned, Friends of the Earth International has worked in most countries, and the concept of a just transition is kind of, I would say, pretty new in South Africa. So part of the process for us was to, what can we learn from our partners, what can we learn from other countries, but also what kind of economic system do we have in South Africa. So if you look into South Africa, like I earlier mentioned, our economic system regards people as consumers. So if I want vegetables, I cannot go to the lady at the corner and buy my vegetables. I have to go to, for instance, one of the retail stores and get my vegetables. And we've seen how these big corporations sometimes collaborate with each other to raise the food prices, and what kind of impact that has on ordinary people. But we also know that most of the land that's been taken by mines, ordinary people used to live in that area. They used to do their own organic agriculture or farming. And most of us, even when we live in urban settlement, would go to these places and get some fresh produce for our own consumption at reasonable prices. So that trend has been slowly being destroyed and eroded, such that we are all dependent on, I would say, the markets. So we picked up that part of commercial agriculture requires that they use a lot of energy to produce the goods. But if you promote organic and subsistence farming, then people do not require a lot of energy, but they require a lot of, I would say, human resources and human interaction. So you produce, you supply your goods locally. That provides livelihoods to everyone at a reasonable rate. So this is what we picked up when we were looking into how does the energy and food system interact with each other in the South African context.
Quite often when speaking about just transition and its transition from coal and oil and gas to more green ways of producing energy like solar power and wind power and so forth. But it's not often that the issue of energy consumption is addressed. And I think this is exactly what you point at, that we also have to look at that, where other ways of producing food, food sovereignty and small-scale food production is part of the solution and is one of the ingredients in a just transition. I mean, you spoke a lot about local democracy. You spoke about consumers and workers, that they have to be brought to the negotiation or the decision-making tables, and they have to be, as rights holders, they have to be the ones who are part of deciding on what this just transition should look like. Now, that means that local communities also need to engage on issues that they maybe do not engage on in their daily life. And I know this is also part of the work of groundWorks, but can you just add a few words for final remarks here on how you work with the communities in order for them to be able to engage in a just transition?
So yeah, I think it's I would say from my personal perspective, I kind of you get to refine what a just transition means along the way. I think in my latest definition was when we talk about just transition, we talk about basic services. You know, what kind of services do people have access to? For instance, you begin to make them ask a question like, do I need energy or do I need Eskom? And I'm mentioning Eskom because they're the ones who are producing energy through coal. So if people were given an alternative to generate their electricity in a different way, will that work for them rather than relying on coal? So these are the questions we begin to ask people so that they begin to realize as to whether are we really dependent on the fossil fuels or somebody is making us feel like we are dependent. But also what is quite interesting is to say we've seen a high level of corruption being exposed in South Africa, and solely it's because we never held our own officials accountable, but also because there was a lot of secrecy in between. So what is it that is needed for people to take informed decisions? And one will always argue that we need better information in this regard. But do we have access to that information? Most commonly, no, we don't, because government hides most of that information. So as a form of starting, again, the process of a just transition is to say, we need information to be publicly available. We need the record of decisions to be publicly available, because people could begin to question as to why a specific decision was taken in that context without considering the inputs of people. So I think this is where we need to begin to say, every information that's being taken at government level that has an impact or affects people, that decision needs to be available in a public portal so that people could begin to hold officials accountable. But also that process will speak to how people are involved in decision-making processes. We cannot be involved in decision-making processes if also we still lack information. So we need to make sure that information is publicly available. But also, I think, lastly, what is important for us is to say, what is it that we can learn from other people? So currently within groundWork, we are toying around with the idea of going all over Europe and see which countries have gone through a transition, both negative and positive, and say, how many of those people can we bring to South Africa so that they could share their experiences? So, for instance, we see the challenges that are happening in Germany right now with the coal phase out. Can we get maybe 1 or 2 people from Germany to come and speak about that? We've seen some challenges with UK. Can we get people from around the UK to share their expertise around that? So I think we are currently working on what we call an international coal exchange. And in that exchange, the plan is to bring different people from all walks of the world so that they could share their experiences around that. We will bring people from Brazil so that they could share how they work through agriculture to change their system so that they become self-reliant. So at the end of the day, I think what is important is for us to create a conducive environment for communities and workers to realize that we need to be self-reliant in order to make meaningful changes, both in terms of our economy and our democratic practices.
Thanks, Thomas. Well said. I think the issue of access to information and sharing lessons from around the world, I mean, that's exactly what you have contributed to in this interview. I want to thank you for that. And to our listeners, I recommend that you go to the notes and check out the links, because we're providing links from the groundWork website on critical reports that groundWork has produced. And with these words, Thomas, thank you very much for participating in the interview.
Thanks for your time, Kirsten. Enjoy your day.
Yeah, thanks. You too. Bye-bye.